They said she was too small to be a soldier, let alone a Marine. From the first day she walked into the training grounds, her compact frame and lean build drew smirks from recruits and doubtful glances from instructors. Most of the women who had passed through before her had struggled with the endless drills, the brutal physical trials, and the relentless mental warfare that defined Marine life. And here she was, barely 5 feet tall, with hands that seemed too delicate to hold a rifle steady for hours and shoulders that did not look like they could carry the weight of a fallen comrade. Her name was Elena Cruz, and to many she was a mismatch for the battlefield. But Elena had grown used to underestimation. It had followed her since childhood, shadowing her in every sport she attempted, every challenge she embraced, and every room full of people who sized her up by appearance before they ever bothered to test her spirit. Her answer to all of them had always been the same: persistence, unyielding and sharp as steel. In the barracks, the other recruits sometimes teased her. Not cruelly, not with the venom that breaks spirits, but with that thoughtless laughter soldiers use to hide their own exhaustion and fears. They called her half-pint, or little one, or sometimes Pixie. Elena never fought the nicknames. She simply trained harder, running until her legs burned, lifting until her arms trembled, and holding her ground in combat drills until even the largest men respected her tenacity. Her instructors learned quickly that beneath her small frame was a core of relentless fire. She was always the last to quit, the one who encouraged others when their muscles gave out, the one who quietly turned her weakness into a weapon of endurance. Still, doubt lingered in the air around her, subtle but present, the kind that could weigh heavier than any rucksack. Could someone so small truly stand firm when the battlefield turned to chaos and fire? The chance to answer that question came months later, not during training, not in drills, but in the blistering reality of war. Elena's unit had been deployed to a conflict zone where every day blurred into a struggle between survival and duty. The region was volatile, with shifting alliances and enemy ambushes waiting behind every shadowed ridge. The Marines lived in constant readiness, sleeping lightly, eating quickly, and moving as if every step might be their last. Elena had adjusted, not by trying to outmuscle her comrades, but by sharpening her awareness, learning to read danger before it struck, and finding ways to turn her agility into advantage. In the field, she was quick, quiet, and fiercely reliable. Slowly, the whispers of doubt softened. She was proving herself one mission at a time. Then came the day that would etch her name into memory. It began like countless others, the heat pressing down like a weight, dust rising with every movement, the scent of oil and metal lingering in the air. Her unit was tasked with securing a hostile area after reports of insurgents moving through the ruins of an abandoned compound. The Marines moved cautiously, weapons ready, eyes scanning every shadow. Elena was near the rear, her senses heightened, when the first explosion tore through the silence. A fireball erupted ahead, swallowing part of the building and sending debris raining down. The ground shuddered, the air filled with screams, and in an instant the mission dissolved into chaos. Gunfire cracked from unseen angles, the compound turning into a kill zone. The Marines fought to regroup, but another explosion followed, cutting off their exit. Flames leapt from the wreckage, thick black smoke curling into the sky. Elena's heart hammered, but training anchored her movements. She ducked behind cover, scanning the field, trying to assess where her brothers in arms had fallen. Through the smoke, she saw shapes sprawled across the ground, Marines hit by the blast, some struggling weakly, others terrifyingly still. Her sergeant's voice roared commands through the radio, but the noise and fire swallowed direction. The squad was scattered, pinned down by enemy fire and hemmed in by the growing blaze. It was the kind of moment that crushed unprepared soldiers, the kind that tested every ounce of courage a person possessed. Elena didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the first Marine she spotted, weaving through falling debris, ignoring the sting of heat licking her skin. The man was heavy, far heavier than she was, and blood darkened his uniform. Elena hooked her arms under his, dragged him with every ounce of strength she had, teeth clenched as she pulled him away from the flames. The weight felt unbearable, but she refused to release him. She could hear gunfire still cracking, but her focus narrowed into a tunnel. One Marine, one task, one moment of survival. She reached cover, gasping for breath, and then turned back without a pause. The second Marine was worse off, pinned beneath a broken beam. Elena fought with frantic strength, shoving, lifting, straining until her muscles screamed. For a moment, doubt whispered she was too small, too weak, too late. But she roared against it, found leverage, and hauled the beam enough to drag him free. Her body trembled, lungs burning, but her will did not falter. She pulled him toward the others, her boots slipping in ash and blood. Behind her, the compound groaned, walls collapsing in flames. Ahead of her, she could see only more shadows of fallen comrades. She knew this was only the beginning. By the time she returned for the third, smoke had reduced visibility to nearly nothing. Elena wrapped her scarf around her mouth, eyes stinging, body aching. She could hear cries, some close, some distant, and each one tore at her. Every second mattered, every choice meant life or death. She lifted again, dragged again, forced her body past limits that had long since shattered. Somewhere deep inside, where doubt once lived, a new fire had taken hold. They had said she was too small. Now, with the world burning around her, she was proving them wrong one life at a time. The fire roared like a living beast, devouring walls, floors, and memories of the building that had once stood. Elena's lungs fought for air, but each breath carried ash and heat that burned her throat. She stumbled over debris as she pushed forward again, the screams of her injured comrades guiding her through the smoke. The instinct to survive screamed at her to turn back, to retreat to safety and regroup, but she refused. Her squad was her family, and family was not abandoned. She had carried 2 men to shelter already, dragged them through fire and dust with strength that should not have belonged to someone her size. Yet she knew there were more. Somewhere inside that inferno, the rest of her brothers were waiting, helpless, perhaps dying. She couldn't let them die alone. The 4th Marine lay half buried under shattered masonry, a thick slab pinning his legs. His eyes were half shut, his breathing shallow, but he stirred when she crouched beside him. "You're gonna be okay," Elena whispered, though she had no certainty in her words. Her hands tore at the stone, fingers raw, nails splitting, but the debris would not move. She braced her small frame, pressing her shoulder into the edge, and heaved. Pain lanced through her spine, fire through her arms, but slowly, inch by inch. The slab shifted. A choked groan escaped the Marine as she dragged him free. He was heavier than the others, his body limp, but Elena refused to feel weakness. Step by step, she dragged him back, her boots carving trails in the soot. Behind her, the fire crept closer, its heat a constant reminder that hesitation meant death. By the time she laid him beside the others, her muscles quivered uncontrollably, her skin blackened with soot. But she rose again. There was no time for rest. Through the smoke she found her sergeant, lying twisted on the ground. A jagged piece of shrapnel had torn through his side, blood seeping into the dirt beneath him. His face was pale, eyes glassy, but he clutched his rifle as though ready to fight even in his final moments. "Cruz?" he rasped when he recognized her. "Leave me. Get the others out." She shook her head violently. "Not a chance, Sarge. You're coming with me." He tried to argue, tried to tell her she was wasting precious time, but Elena didn't listen. She knelt, looping her arms under him, and began the agonizing process of dragging his body across the wreckage. Every foot of progress felt like a mile. His weight was crushing, his blood soaking into her uniform, but she would not abandon him. Somewhere deep inside she found strength that wasn't physical, strength born of loyalty and defiance, the kind that had fueled her since the day she first stepped into the barracks. When at last she dropped beside the cluster of wounded Marines, her chest heaving, she allowed herself a single second of satisfaction. 5 saved. 3 more to go. But time was bleeding away. The structure was collapsing, with fiery beams crashing down like thunderbolts. The air was so thick with smoke that her eyes watered uncontrollably, and each breath was a war. She could barely hear any more, the world muffled by ringing from the explosions. Still, she forced her legs to move. She found another Marine near what had once been a doorway, sprawled on his stomach. His back was scorched, his helmet gone, and he didn't stir as she approached. She grabbed his vest, rolling him onto his side. A weak gasp rattled in his chest. Relief shot through her, he was alive. Without hesitation, she gripped his gear and dragged him, every pull tearing at her exhausted muscles. The floor beneath her feet trembled with the groaning of the dying structure, but she refused to let fear dictate her movements. She thought of her unit, the laughter in the barracks, the names they had given her, and the respect she had earned. She thought of home, of all the people who never believed she could stand shoulder to shoulder with Marines. And she thought of how wrong they were. By the time she returned, 6 Marines lay clustered together in the relative safety of the courtyard. They were bloodied, burned, broken, but they were alive because she had refused to yield. Yet she wasn't finished. Somewhere inside, she knew 2 more were waiting. She turned back into the flames without hesitation, her legs trembling, her vision swimming. It no longer mattered that she was small. It no longer mattered that her body had been pushed past all sane limits. The only thing that mattered was the mission: bring them all out or die trying. She found the 7th Marine in the wreckage of a stairwell, pinned beneath twisted steel. The air here was nearly unbreathable, the heat suffocating, but Elena dove in anyway. She yanked at the steel with frantic determination, her hands blistering, her shoulders screaming. For a moment, despair threatened to break her. The beam wouldn't budge and her strength was nearly gone. But then she remembered every insult, every doubt, every smirk that told her she was too small, too fragile, too weak. She roared with defiance, heaved with all that was left in her, and the steel shifted just enough. She dragged him free, ignoring the pain, ignoring the flames curling dangerously close. One more, she thought. Just one more. Her body was near collapse by the time she staggered back into the open with the 7th Marine. She dropped him with the others, gasped for air, and then turned once more toward the inferno. She had promised herself all 8 would live no matter what it cost. The final Marine was still inside. She pushed forward again, her vision narrowing, her body screaming for rest. The fire clawed at her skin, smoke filled her lungs, but she would not stop. She had come this far. She would not let the last of her brothers die alone. The inferno swallowed her as she entered again, and this time it felt as though the fire itself was alive, furious at her defiance. The walls around her sagged, beams collapsing with deafening crashes, sparks exploding in the air like angry stars. Elena stumbled forward, coughing violently, her lungs clawing for oxygen in the choking blackness. Her body had reached the edge of collapse long ago, every muscle trembled as if it might give way, and her vision blurred until the world shifted in dizzy fragments. But inside her chest burned a will that no flame could consume. 7 Marines lay alive outside because she had refused to believe what everyone else once told her, that she was too small, too weak, too fragile. One more waited. She would not leave without him. The 8th Marine's voice reached her faintly, carried through the crackle of fire and the groan of falling stone. A hoarse cry, desperate, yet enough to pierce through the chaos. Elena followed it, weaving through debris, stumbling, nearly falling as the ground buckled beneath her. She found him in the remains of a corridor, his body pinned beneath collapsed timber and broken concrete. Blood matted his hair, one leg twisted unnaturally, but his chest still rose and fell. His eyes flickered open as she approached, disbelief written across his soot-smeared face. "Cruz?" he rasped. "What the hell are you doing? Get out, leave me." She dropped to her knees beside him, ignoring the plea. "Not a chance," she said, her voice hoarse but unyielding. "You're coming with me." The beam pinning him was massive, far heavier than anything she had moved before. Elena gritted her teeth, pressed her shoulder against it, and pushed with everything left in her. The beam didn't move. Her body screamed in protest, her arms trembling violently. She tried again, heaving, her boots scraping against the scorched floor, but again the beam refused to budge. For the first time, a sliver of despair crept into her chest. She had carried 7 men from hell, but here at the last her strength was failing. She closed her eyes, choking on smoke, and remembered every step that had brought her here. She remembered the laughter in training, the doubt in their eyes, the names they gave her. She remembered the nights she stayed awake, whispering promises to herself that she would prove them wrong. And then she remembered the faces of the 7 Marines outside, alive because she had refused to stop. With a roar that tore from the deepest part of her, Elena pressed her shoulder under the beam once more. Pain ripped through her muscles, but she refused to yield. She thought not of her size, not of her weakness, but of the trust her brothers had placed in her, whether they knew it or not. Inch by inch, the beam shifted, enough for her to wedge her body beneath it, enough to drag him free. The Marine groaned in agony as she pulled him, but he lived, and that was all that mattered. Her arms burned as if fire ran through her veins, her knees buckled, but she kept dragging, pulling him toward the exit. The building fought to hold her captive. The ground trembled as another explosion ripped through the structure, hurling dust and flames around her. The ceiling cracked, chunks of debris raining down dangerously close. Elena shielded the Marine with her body, taking the brunt of falling embers against her back. Her uniform smoldered, skin blistering beneath the heat, but she didn't slow. Step by agonizing step, she dragged him forward, her body little more than raw determination holding itself together. She no longer felt the pain fully, it had become a constant presence, a background roar drowned by the singular focus of survival. All she knew was forward. The corridor seemed endless, stretching on like some cruel illusion. Every few feet, Elena collapsed to her knees, gasping, but she forced herself back up, gripping the Marine's vest with blistered hands. Her vision narrowed into a tunnel of flame, her ears filled with the pounding of her heart. She no longer thought about failure. She no longer wondered whether she could. She simply moved because stopping meant death, and death was not an option. Her strength was no longer physical. It was something deeper, primal, drawn from the bond of those who fight side by side and call each other brother. Finally, through the choking smoke, she glimpsed daylight. The exit lay ahead, blurred and wavering like a mirage, but real enough to ignite a final spark of determination in her battered body. She screamed with the last of her voice, dragging the Marine into the open air just as the building behind them collapsed in a deafening roar. The blast of heat knocked her to the ground, but she shielded the Marine with her own body, refusing to let the fire claim him now. When the thunder quieted and the dust settled, Elena lay sprawled, gasping for breath, the Marine still beneath her arms. Around her, the surviving Marines stirred, battered but alive. They watched in stunned silence as she pulled the eighth man into their circle, then collapsed beside them, her chest heaving, her body trembling uncontrollably. No words came at first. There was only the sound of labored breathing, the distant crackle of flames, the sharp taste of smoke in the air. Finally, one of the men whispered, his voice thick with awe, "She did it. All of us, she carried us all." The others, bloodied and broken, turned their eyes toward her, and in that moment there was no trace of doubt left. The woman they had once called too small, too fragile, too weak, had just carried 8 Marines through fire to safety. Elena closed her eyes, exhaustion dragging her down, but a faint smile touched her lips. She had nothing left to give, not an ounce of strength, but she had done what no one thought possible. In the silence that followed, the truth became undeniable. She was not too small. She had never been. She was a Marine, forged in fire, defined by her will, and stronger than any who had ever underestimated her. The battlefield quieted only gradually, as though the fire itself was reluctant to release its grip. The collapsed compound still smoldered, a skeleton of twisted steel and shattered stone, but the enemy gunfire had faded into silence. Reinforcements had finally broken through, pushing the insurgents back and securing the perimeter. Medics rushed forward, their kits clattering as they dropped beside the wounded Marines. The air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and blood, but for Elena, lying on her back in the dirt, the world narrowed to nothing more than gasping breaths and the heavy weight of exhaustion pressing her into the earth. She could hear the groans of her brothers, the hurried commands of medics, and boots pounding against scorched soil, yet it all felt distant, muffled, as if she were floating in some half-conscious haze. One of the medics crouched beside her, pressing cool hands against her burned arms and blistered palms. "She's still breathing," he called out, his voice urgent but steady. Severe exhaustion, smoke inhalation, burns across her back and shoulders. Elena stirred faintly, blinking through the blur in her eyes. She wanted to tell him to tend to the others first, but her voice cracked into nothing but a rasp. Still, the medic seemed to understand. He gave her a firm nod, then moved quickly toward the Marines she had dragged out of hell one by one. Elena tried to push herself upright, but her body refused to obey. Her muscles had reached their absolute limit, trembling with every breath, yet she could not stop her eyes from searching. She counted. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 8. They were alive. Broken, burned, bloodied, but alive. A wave of relief rolled over her so strong it drowned out the pain. Her sergeant, pale and barely conscious, caught her gaze from where he lay propped against another Marine. His lips moved, forming words she could just barely make out. "You saved us." Elena swallowed hard, her throat raw, and managed the smallest nod. It didn't matter if her body was ruined, it didn't matter if tomorrow never came. She had done her duty. No, more than that. She had proven herself in a way no words could ever deny. The sergeant's eyes glistened with something she had never seen in him before, not just respect, but reverence. He had once doubted her just like the others. Now doubt was gone forever. As medevac helicopters thundered overhead, stirring ash into whirlwinds, the Marines were loaded one by one onto stretchers. Elena fought weakly when they came for her, trying to wave them off. She didn't want to be carried when she had carried them. She didn't want anyone to think she was too weak to stand. But when she tried to push herself up, her legs buckled instantly, and the medics caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy, soldier," one of them said firmly. "You've done enough for 10 lifetimes." Reluctantly, she allowed them to strap her into the stretcher, her body finally conceding to the rest it had long since been denied. As the helicopter lifted off, Elena's mind drifted between wakefulness and unconsciousness. The world outside the open door blurred, smoke rising from the compound, figures moving like shadows in the haze, flames flickering against the dying light. But over all of it she could hear voices. Not jeers, not nicknames, not doubt. Voices filled with awe, with pride, with gratitude. She saved us all. Carried every damn one of us. She's the reason we're breathing right now. The words followed her into the haze of exhaustion, wrapping around her like armor, stronger than any steel. In the field hospital, the hours stretched into days as doctors treated burns, stitched wounds, and monitored breathing. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, her body repairing itself slowly. When she finally woke fully, she found herself in a white-walled room, sunlight streaming faintly through a canvas flap. Bandages covered her arms and shoulders, her throat still raw, but she was alive. More importantly, so were her brothers. The first thing she asked, her voice barely audible, was, "The others?" The nurse beside her smiled softly. "They're all stable. Because of you." Relief washed through her like a tide, and tears she hadn't allowed herself before slipped silently down her soot-stained face. When her squad mates were strong enough to visit, they came in pairs, hobbling on crutches or leaning heavily on one another, but determined to see her. Each man carried scars of that day, but each was alive because she had refused to quit. They didn't call her Half-Pint anymore. They didn't call her Pixie. When they spoke her name now, it was with respect, heavy with gratitude. The sergeant, still weak but recovering, took her hand and squeezed it tightly. "Cruz," he said, his voice gravelly but steady, "I've been a Marine for 20 years. I've seen bravery, I've seen sacrifice. But what you did, it's beyond anything I've ever witnessed. You carried 8 Marines out of hell itself. Don't ever let anyone tell you you're too small again." Elena tried to laugh, but it came out as a soft cough. "I couldn't leave you," she whispered simply. "Any of you." And in those words was the essence of her soul. Not glory, not pride, not the need to prove herself anymore, but loyalty. The kind of loyalty that turns frailty into power, doubt into steel, and a small frame into an unstoppable force. She hadn't done it to prove she belonged. She had done it because they were her brothers. That was enough. Long before her body healed, word of her actions had already begun to spread through the base, carried like wildfire in the whispers of soldiers who needed a story of hope. They spoke of the tiny Marine who defied fire and death to carry her entire squad to safety. The story grew, passed from barracks to command posts, from one camp to another, until it reached officers who rarely heard tales from the field in such vivid detail. And though Elena didn't know it yet, her name was beginning to echo far beyond that ruined compound. News traveled fast in war zones, faster than supply trucks and sometimes faster than bullets. Within a week of the rescue, Elena's name had become something whispered in mess halls and repeated in radio chatter across distant outposts. Soldiers who had never met her spoke with reverence, describing the little Marine who carried 8 men out of fire. Each telling grew slightly more dramatic. Some claimed she had carried them on her shoulders one by one, others that she had fought off enemies single-handedly while dragging bodies through smoke. The truth was already extraordinary, but myths always grow where inspiration is scarce. To Marines and soldiers battered by endless conflict, her story was a spark, proof that impossible things could be done when courage refused to bend. Elena, however, did not feel like the woman in the stories. In the sterile quiet of the hospital tent, she wrestled with her own doubts. Yes, she had dragged them out, fought until her body nearly broke, but she couldn't forget the moments where despair had almost claimed her. She remembered the beam that wouldn't move, the times her knees buckled, the terror that nipped at her heels every second inside that inferno. She had been afraid, she had been weak, and she had nearly failed. The legend being told painted her as something superhuman, but she knew the truth. She was just a Marine who couldn't abandon her brothers. That was all. She feared that the more people called her a hero, the further they moved from understanding what had really happened. It wasn't about glory. It was about loyalty and desperation. Her squad didn't let her retreat into that doubt. Every day 1 or 2 of them came to her bedside. They brought laughter, rough jokes, and stories from their recovery. They teased her about how she had ruined their excuses for being slow on marches. "If Cruz can carry me through a damn fire, I don't ever want to hear you complain about a 20-mile hike again," one Marine chuckled, his legs still wrapped in bandages. The camaraderie warmed her in ways the medals and recognition never could. These were the men who had doubted her once, who had called her too small. Now they looked at her with unwavering respect, their voices heavy with gratitude whenever they said her name. To them she wasn't a legend or a myth. She was Elena, their sister, their savior. Then came the day when her commanding officer visited. A tall man with iron-gray hair and the kind of presence that quieted a room without words, Colonel Myers stood at her bedside with eyes that measured everything. Elena straightened instinctively, even though pain lanced through her back. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I've read the reports. I've spoken with the men. They all say the same thing, that you carried them out when the world was burning down around them. His voice was steady, authoritative, but Elena felt her stomach twist. She didn't know how to respond. She hadn't done it for reports or recognition. She had done it because she couldn't imagine doing anything else. Sir, I couldn't leave them, she said softly. Myers nodded slowly, his gaze unyielding but not unkind. That's the difference between a soldier and a Marine, he said. A soldier follows orders. A Marine refuses to let his brothers die, even when the cost is everything. He leaned closer, his tone dropping. You're going to be recognized for this, Cruz. Not just by me, not just by your unit, but by the Corps itself. You need to be ready for that. The word struck her harder than any explosion. Recognition. The very thing she had once secretly longed for, back when everyone dismissed her. But now that it was here, it felt heavy, almost suffocating. She didn't want to be a symbol. She didn't want speeches or ceremonies. She wanted her brothers safe, nothing more. When she was strong enough to walk again, she stepped outside the medical tent into the open air. The sun was bright, the sky a piercing blue, and for a moment she simply stood, breathing it in. Around her, Marines nodded as she passed, some with salutes, some with words of thanks. It was surreal to be looked at like that. She hadn't changed, she was still Elena, still the woman who had been mocked for being too small, but their eyes told a different story now. She felt the weight of it pressing against her shoulders. She had carried 8 Marines through fire, but now she carried something invisible, expectation. At night, when sleep was thin and memories replayed behind her eyelids, she asked herself whether she deserved the title of hero. Heroes, she thought, weren't supposed to be afraid. They weren't supposed to hesitate. Yet she had felt fear at every step, had nearly collapsed under the weight of her comrades. She remembered the way her hands shook, the moment she thought she might fail. But then she also remembered something else. She had kept moving anyway. Maybe being a hero wasn't about being fearless. Maybe it was about refusing to let fear decide the outcome. The weeks that followed brought official debriefings, commendations, and paperwork that reduced her impossible ordeal into clinical language, acted with exceptional bravery, displayed extraordinary valor under fire. The words were clean, polished, stripped of the smoke, blood, and desperation that had defined every second of that day. Elena listened to them being read aloud and felt oddly detached, as if they were speaking of someone else. Yet every time she returned to the barracks and saw her squad alive, their laughter echoing through the night, she knew the truth. Hero or not, she had done what mattered most. And still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Her name was spreading, climbing its way through ranks she had never imagined reaching. Soon, she would be called to stand in front of generals and crowds, to be applauded and saluted. Part of her wanted to run from it, to hide back in the anonymity of her unit. But another part, the fire that had always burned against doubt, knew this was her path now. She had carried her brothers through fire. Now she would have to carry the weight of being their symbol. By the time Elena was discharged from the field hospital, her name had already reached headquarters. Reports had been filed, interviews with survivors collected, and the story had spread beyond the dusty outpost where it began. What had started as whispers among soldiers had traveled through command channels and into the ears of officers who had never set foot near the flames she fought through. Soon, the tale was being repeated in polished phrases by men in pressed uniforms. One Marine carried 8 wounded comrades through an inferno to safety. The words were clinical, stripped of smoke and pain, but the impact was undeniable. Elena Cruz had become more than a soldier. She was a story, one that gave hope to a military weary of war. She returned to her unit slowly, her body still healing, bandages covering her arms and burns across her shoulders. When she stepped into the barracks, every man in the room rose. It wasn't the exaggerated formality of a drill, it was respect, raw and unspoken. Some clapped her on the back gently, careful of her injuries. Others simply nodded, eyes heavy with gratitude. She felt heat rise to her cheeks under their gaze. These were the same men who had once teased her for her size, who had doubted she could keep up. Now they looked at her as if she had changed the definition of what a Marine could be. And maybe she had. But life didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Not when her story kept rippling outward, reaching ears that had never heard her name before. Letters arrived from strangers, some written by fellow Marines stationed far away, others from families back home who had read a brief mention in newsletters. "You remind us why we're proud," one letter read. Another said, "Because of you, my brother believes he can survive." The weight of those words pressed on her in a way the fire never had. She had never asked to be anyone's inspiration. She had just wanted to bring her brothers home. Then came the official orders. She was to be recognized with honors. A medal ceremony was scheduled at a larger base, and she was to attend in dress uniform. The thought filled her with dread. Standing in front of generals, reporters, and cameras felt more daunting than dragging men through fire. She had always fought to prove herself in silence, through action. Words and applause were foreign, almost suffocating. Still, she knew refusing was not an option. The Marine Corps wanted to hold her up as proof of resilience and courage, and Elena would not dishonor her brothers by denying it. The day of the ceremony dawned bright, the sky sharp and clear above the parade ground. Rows of Marines stood in formation, their uniforms immaculate, their boots polished to mirrors. A stage had been erected, flags snapping crisply in the wind. Elena stood among them, her dress blues fitting snugly across bandages hidden beneath. She felt exposed, vulnerable as the crowd gathered, officers, enlisted men, even members of the press with cameras ready. When her name was called, a hush fell across the assembly. She stepped forward, each movement deliberate, her chin lifted though her stomach nodded. The general pinned the medal to her chest with steady hands, his voice booming through the speakers. For extraordinary valor under fire, for carrying 8 Marines through the flames of certain death, for embodying the very spirit of the Corps, we honor Sergeant Elena Cruz. The applause thundered, echoing across the parade ground, but Elena hardly heard it. She was staring at the faces of her squad in the crowd, battered but alive, watching her with pride shining in their eyes. That was the only audience that mattered to her. When the ceremony ended, reporters swarmed. Questions flew at her like bullets. How did you do it? Were you afraid? What gave you the strength? Elena answered sparingly, her voice calm but quiet. I did what any Marine would do, she told them. I couldn't leave them behind. It was the truth, plain and unadorned, though she knew many would twist it into something more dramatic. She didn't care. Let them tell the story however they wanted. She knew the reality, fear, fire, pain, and the refusal to stop. As the weeks passed, her face appeared in newsletters, military broadcasts, even a few national papers. Civilians back home debated her courage, some calling her a hero, others questioning how such a small woman could have done what she did. The skeptics reminded her of the voices she had heard all her life, but this time their doubt no longer mattered. She had nothing left to prove. She had carried her brothers, and they were alive to speak for her. Still, the attention weighed heavily. In quiet moments, when the cameras were gone and the speeches finished, Elena sat with her squad by the fire pit outside their barracks. They joked, they laughed, they teased her gently. Our pint-sized superhero, one said with a grin, but beneath the laughter was something sacred. They had survived together. They had faced hell and she had brought them home. That bond mattered more than any medal, more than any headline. Late one night, staring up at the endless stars, Elena finally admitted to herself that her life had changed forever. She would never again be just another Marine. She was a story now, one carried in the hearts of soldiers who needed to believe in miracles. It frightened her, yes, but it also filled her with a strange, quiet pride. Not for herself, but for what it meant to others. If her story gave even one person the strength to carry on, then maybe the fire had been worth it. The metal gleamed on her uniform, but Elena quickly realized that a piece of metal could weigh heavier than any Marine she had carried from the fire. Before the rescue, she had blended into the rhythm of the unit. Training, marching, fighting, laughing. She had been one of many, a part of the whole, her size making her nearly invisible when she wanted it that way. But after the ceremony, invisibility became impossible. Everywhere she went, eyes followed. Marines she had never spoken to before straightened when she passed, some saluting even when protocol didn't require it. Others stared openly, whispering, their voices filled with awe. It was respect, yes, but it was also distance. She was no longer just Elena Cruz, the half-pint of her unit. She had become something larger, something untouchable. At first she hated it. She didn't want reverence. She didn't want men saluting her because of a story they only half understood. She wanted to sweat beside them, curse during long marches, laugh in the mess hall without anyone looking twice. But the story of carrying 8 Marines through fire had turned her into a symbol, and symbols aren't treated like people. She found herself isolated in ways she had never expected. Even her squad, though still warm and close, sometimes stumbled into silence around her, as if reminded she was now a living legend.